Great. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. Really happy to be talking about interpreting, which is a very important part of providing legal services. My name is Peggy Stevenson, officially Margaret, and I've been an attorney for about 40 years, 10 years in legal services, and then the last 30 years as a teacher in community-based programs. David?
Yes, hello, my name is David Gomez Cruz. I finished my undergrad, I think about almost 2 years ago. I like the work that we were doing here with the program, so I asked Peggy if I could continue doing the work. So I first started off volunteering, and now I am a staff member with this program, doing a lot of different things, translating. Um, I mean, it's given to me. And hopefully I can do it. Just future goals real quick. I do plan to go to law school, which was something I wasn't even thinking about while I was doing my undergrad, but now that's on the plate for me. Just gotta get that process started.
Great. We've LAC has asked us to read the slides for increasing accessibility for folks. So we will be going through. David's going to be managing the slides. We will be reading them, but and then talking and elaborating. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A and the chat. We've got a couple polls we're going to be launching right now, I think, to get a sense of the things, the perspective of those of you joining, and so that we can be sure to be tailoring our comments to make them as useful as possible. So as you can see, the first poll is up. The question is, what is your primary role in the office where you work? And we've got answers of attorney, legal assistant or paralegal, front desk staff, director or deputy director, grants or administration, or other. So if you could give you a few seconds to fill that in, that would be helpful so we can be sure that we're, like I said, being as useful as possible. This is a practical session, so we want to be sure that we're directing this in our comments in helpful ways. Maybe a few more seconds. We've got, I don't know if you can see this live as you're watching, we've got 62%, up to 67% of participants answering. And a lot of attorneys, which we did this, I think, just at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was about 50-50 split between folks, office staff who were working as interpreters and attorneys, but I see we have a heavier attorney representation now. Okay, well, let's end that poll. Thanks. And now that I guess you can see the results were there. We're about 67% of those responding are attorneys, and 21% are legal assistants. So I think we might as well just go on, if it's okay, with just the next two polls. They're, again, questions about the practices that you have in the offices where you work.
Sorry, I think all three of them were shared at once. Sorry about that.
Oh, were they? Oh, okay.
So if you scroll down, it should have the results.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was only just looking at the top one. Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, we also have a quick Q&A from Leah Kang saying having a little trouble hearing Margaret.
Oh, okay.
So
all right. Well, let me see. Is this better? I've got a microphone here. I can hold it up. Are others having trouble? Sorry about that. Okay. It looks like maybe others can hear. So we've got, is that a response, David?
yeah, I think it was.
We're okay.
Been handled,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then the second one, the second question was the language in which the clients in the office need interpreting, and we've got 93% Spanish. which is comparable, slightly higher than the court interpreting that we see. The stats for that are about 85% of interpreters are doing that in Spanish. And then Vietnamese, 33%, and indigenous language, 13%, Cantonese, Farsi, Hmong, Mandarin, Tagalog, and other. Cool. And then, okay, so good. So that's the last question was, have you been trained on legal interpreting in the past? And 58% say yes, which is very encouraging. Hopefully that this will also be a useful training, and just kind of if these are things that you know, then reinforcing well, you already know the import of it, being able to communicate with clients. But certainly back in my day and practice times, nobody thought about working with interpreters, and so it's been kind of a hopefully growing trend that people have been paying attention to the need to do this accurately, and for people to understand the dynamics and work that interpreters and attorneys do in working with interpreters. So let's get started. And David, if you could please put up the first of the slides. As he's doing that, the first slide says the difference between interpreting and translating. And interpreting and translating are different. People often use those terms interchangeably, but in fact, interpreting deals with spoken words, and translating deals with written words. So if you're working with a client in the interview context, which is the main focus that we'll be doing today, it will be interpreting. If you're preparing documents for example, taking a letter of support, or a document that's in another language and translating the document for the court, that would be translating and not interpreting. So today the focus is on interpreting in legal interviews in legal services offices. We're going to touch on court interpreting, but that's not the focus. It's different from the day-to-day operations, where very often even attorneys who are fluent in one language will be representing clients who speak a different language. So we'll go on to the next slide. And the goal of this, the agenda here today will be to talk about the goal of interpreted interviews. And the goal of those interviews is to have the client and the attorney feel that they're speaking directly to each other, that the interpreter is basically dropped out of the picture, isn't there. We're going to see a clip in a little bit from The West Wing, where hopefully that becomes clear that it's just we're just communicating between one person and another, even though there's an interpreter. In that case, it's an American Sign Language ASL interpreter who's there. And also today, what we're going to be covering is, as I mentioned, is practical considerations. We'll talk about how to get set up, the introductions, the seating. We'll talk about the mechanics of conveying information completely and directly. That includes looking at the wording of the questions or comments that we make, idioms, when the interpreter needs to seek clarification, and intonation that the interpreter will be using in interpreting the client's comments. And then at the end, we'll talk about ethical considerations involved in working with an interpreter. So if people have not already done so, I highly recommend anybody who's in an office, a neighborhood legal services office, have something like the language identification chart that's pictured on the side of this. What that allows is somebody to, the side of the slide, what that allows is somebody who does not speak English, who comes into the office for services, to find their language in their own wording, and then also if it's in a different font, then they can point to the language that's needed. At the end, we have some resources on telephone interpreting, so that can be something that people can schedule. So as we learn what language the client needs to have interpreted, we will schedule an interpreter in that language. We'll use these language charts to help us recognize what that is. And then, as I said, we'll have mention the phone services at the end and have the resource there. So before the interview, now that it's been scheduled and we know someone, since Spanish is the primary language, we'll just use Spanish as an example here. We know that a monolingual Spanish speaker is coming in to speak with an attorney who does not speak Spanish, and an interpreter who is fully bilingual and hopefully bicultural in both English and Spanish have been scheduled. The attorney and the interpreter should briefly discuss before the interview some of these topics, including interpreting techniques, to be sure that both the attorney and the interpreter are aware of interpreting practices that we'll be discussing here. And also, it's helpful for the attorney to mention potentially difficult topics. David and I do record clearance. There are commonly issues of abuse, neglect, sexual violence, abuse, driving under the influence, issues that may come up that the interpreter might find upsetting or surprising. And so it's very helpful if the interpreter has a general idea coming into it, what the topics are likely to be covered, if the attorney has an idea about that. And then the note here is that the interpreter can also mention potentially sensitive cultural considerations. I mentioned in DUI cases, in Islamic culture, there's a prohibition against drinking alcohol. So if the attorney isn't aware of that, it's very helpful for the interpreter to say, by the way, this is something that is not, people do not admit to doing necessarily. But you may see a DUI on the rap sheet, and there may be a reason that the client says that actually didn't happen. So now I'm going to pass this over to David. So we've got practical considerations when the interpreter and the client are getting together in the office.
Yeah. So like we mentioned, we have established that connection between the interpreter and the attorney. Same goes for the interpreter with the client. So before the meeting even starts, the interpreter and the client should be able to communicate with each other effectively. Also establishing some ground rules, so like the use of the word I. Also, so like the use of the word I. I just saw the chat, so I was like, so if the client is using the word I, same should be used by the interpreter, right? So it wouldn't be the client said, it would be saying, I went to the bank, not the client went to the bank. And we'll get into a few examples later down the line. Also, word for word interpreting. So the exact words that the client is or are using should also be said by the interpreter. So like I said, a lot of this is establishing some ground rules before the interview actually starts, right? So using short sentences as well. You don't want the client to speak for 5 minutes straight, and then the only thing the interpreter can grasp was the last sentence the client said, right? So this goes back to word for word interpreting, where you want what the client said translated, or I guess in this case, interpreted on a one-to-one or word for word basis and not just a summary. So another thing as well, right, to mention is when the interpreter and the client know each other outside of the office, this is something that we do take in consideration, right, in terms of explaining, much like Margaret or Peggy was mentioning, just how confidential the information is, whether we're talking about DUIs or maybe some abuse, right? There's always trauma, especially in our field with record reviews, where if the client and the interpreter know each other outside in a personal level, well, clearly this would be something where we would need a different interpreter, right? And this is, as it says here, right, ask whether the client would prefer another interpreter. For the most cases, I think always erring on the side of caution. It's always good practice to um, get a different interpreter for those situations. Talk about practical considerations and logistics, right? Peggy mentioned in the beginning, um, the seating arrangement between the client, attorney, and the interpreter to establish perfect, not perfect, but a good flow in communication. So usually what we have come across is the client and the attorney sit across from one another. So they have and maintain that um, I guess, line of sight or so they can see each other eye to eye, like if they're actually talking to each other, right? The interpreter is just there to establish and have that communication between the client and the attorney possible, right? Same thing here. Last thing on this slide, aside from attorney and client maintain eye contact, the interpreter also uses formal form of address. So uh, I know, like we saw in the polls, a good majority, if not the vast majority of it, is in Spanish. There is a difference between using formal and informal Spanish when talking to someone in this setting. Seeing that it is a formal setting, we would maintain that formal form of addressing the client or the attorney. So, just a quick example, right? If you're talking to your friends, you would use the word tú for you versus usted, which would be just the formal version of that same word of you.
I'm just going to pipe in here just for a minute on the seating. We tend to put the interpreter and the attorney next to each other because otherwise if the client and the interpreter are sitting in next to each other, then the temptation is for the client to turn to the interpreter, and that breaks the connection with the attorney.
Right. In terms of continuing with practical considerations, establishing breaks, multiple speakers, and note taking, right? So one of the things, I mean, breaks are always important, especially if these sessions are an hour long, maybe a little bit longer, right? Breaking it up into small segments, not only is there are a lot of, I mean, communication between the client and the interpreter, right? There's also that second communication between the interpreter and the attorney, right? So not only is it a good idea for breaks just in general, I mean, due to the sensitivity or confidentiality, however traumatic the events may have been possibly, but I mean, it's double the work for the interpreter. So as it says here, right, the interpreter speaking twice as much as the client and the attorney, and most likely, logically, needs to take breaks, right? The next thing here, right, multiple speakers. So, like I mentioned, not only is the client and attorney speaking to one another or speaking to the interpreter, there should be an established rule of only one person speaking at the same time. So, when there are multiple clients or multiple interviewers, like I said, just each one at a time. So if the client speaking, that's the only person who should be speaking, followed by the interpreter relaying that information onto the attorney, and vice versa. We have the attorney speaking, going back to the interpreter, back to the client. Another thing, or the last thing here in terms of note taking, right? The interpreter should be taking notes in terms of noting down numbers, dates, times, or addresses, as well as keywords, right? So even though you have established those rules at the beginning, whether using short sentences, right? Sometimes you get carried away in the conversation and you find yourself 5 minutes in the conversation without having to take a break, right? So we'll be talking about also how to ask for like, oh, could you please slow down in a professional formal manner in that setting, right? So interpreters should be taking notes, right? You always miss something. Dates are always important to go back and if the attorney has a question um, for clarification.
And I'll just add here that it typically goes so fast and the words are kind of going back and forth. So it's hard to take notes about anything other than addresses or numbers really. And that is about all that people are interpreters are able to take notes on. But those are things that typically can be difficult to retrieve and send and interpret. So
Perfect. So continuing with practical considerations, right? Long statements. Interpreters should interject when the speaker goes on too long, right? So start interpreting while the speaker is talking. That is an option, right? And I believe Peggy will go into whether it's simultaneously and being interpreted or not. But also, like I mentioned, if, like I said, the conversations go by so quickly, you're 5 minutes in, not knowing that maybe, right, whether the client or the attorney should have said, like, oh, maybe I should have broken that up into smaller segments, right? So always a good idea to raise your hand slightly to indicate a good stopping place, right? So just right, just showing like, oh, that's a good amount of information that I'll be being able to relay to the attorney in terms of interpreting, right? The attorneys should sub a client's long statement as well, even if the interpreter doesn't, right? So not only does this job fall to the interpreter, but if for whatever reason the interpreter doesn't stop or have a pause or like I said, a good stopping place, the attorney should also be stepping in to make sure that this does occur, right? So right here we just have I guess you could say like a few examples in terms of like possible phrasing. So, right with the hand, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. I would like our interpreter to relate what you are saying, right? So it's not directed to the interpreter to tell the client. It's the attorney themselves taking on that role, talking to the client. So then the interpreter would also um, relay that information to the client.
okay, so the interpreting modes, some practical considerations are simultaneous mode. That is when the interpreter is speaking at the same time as the speaker in the non-English language. This is used in court so that the judge or the jury can understand the speaker. It's going on at the same time. Consecutive is what we use in legal services interviews in offices. That's a back and forth where the interpreter waits for the speaker to finish the phrase and then interprets what's just been said. And as David says, often the interpreter or the attorney will need to slow the client down. This is the first time perhaps that they have been able to tell their story to somebody who is going to be able to help them. And so the feeling is one of relief. And sometimes the temptation is just to continue talking because it's such a relief to get some help. But that doesn't work because you need to be able to have every word understood by the attorney and every word from the attorney to go back to the client. This note here about bring your own interpreter to court or administrative hearings, that's because if you will need to, if you don't share a language with your client, you will need to talk to your client about the proceedings. If there's a witness who's testifying in English, the client won't understand what they're saying, and you need to be listening to what you may not be, you wouldn't be able to be the interpreter anyway if you don't speak that language. You would bring your own interpreter to interpret the English for the client. Also, because court interpreters interpret for the court, they don't interpret for attorneys and clients, and they shouldn't, because that court interpreter, that would break confidentiality. So it needs, ethical considerations limit what conversations an attorney can ask a court interpreter to have with their client, but also to have an inclusive part of the proceeding. The client needs to be able to participate as well when it's not being interpreted to them. And there's a video at the end of this, a short video at the end of this slide deck that you can see on your own that gives examples of simultaneous and consecutive interpreting.
And then just one quick thing that I saw, um, Q&A, right, just from Vanessa Smith. More, I guess, of a comment, and I found it very interesting just because my experience is in Santa Clara County. But Vanessa mentioned that in Alameda County, the court interpreters will interpret for attorneys and clients in the hallway before or after a hearing. In court, interpreting is a priority, but they are available if they have time. So I just found that a little bit interesting, fascinating, very different from my experience in Santa Clara County. But yeah, I don't know, interesting in my opinion. All right, so now we're going to be moving on to conveying information, right? So same person and tense. I mentioned this a little bit in terms of using the word I, right? So interpreters use the same person and tense as the speaker. So an example of this, if the attorney wants to find out how old the client is, we have here the incorrect, then correct example, or I guess answer of how to go out and ask this. So the incorrect way first to the interpreter, right? So the attorney would be asking the interpreter, ask him how old he is, right? So this would be the incorrect way. As we established before, it should be a direct conversation between the attorney and the client. So the correct way would be the attorney asking the client, how old are you, right? And then the client answering in Spanish here, tengo 83 años de edad, right? So there's also the interpreter to relay the client's statement to the attorney, right? Again, here we'll have the incorrect, then correct version. So the incorrect would be the interpreter telling the attorney, he said he is 83 years old, right? As we mentioned, we want this to be just pretty much a one-on-one conversation between the client and the attorney. So the correct way would be the interpreter saying, I am 83 years old, as if it were the client speaking. Right. So here we have a little bit of practice, right? Just laying down a hypothetical, right? You're an attorney at an eviction advice clinic, a non-English speaking tenant, and interpreter are present. You want to know if the client brought a copy of his lease, right? So who you should not ask, right? So let's say I'm the attorney here, right? I'm an attorney at the eviction advice clinic. I'd be asking, or I guess who I would not be asking would be the interpreter, right? Like I mentioned, it should be a one-on-one conversation as if the interpreter were not there. So, um, again, here another question: what you should not say to the interpreter, right? Right. I would not tell the interpreter, ask him if he brought a copy of his lease, right? So much like before, incorrect, then correct, what I should be asking, or who I should be asking the client directly, right? As I mentioned before, and probably will be mentioning later down the line as well, it's a one-on-one conversation between the client and the attorney. Yes, the interpreter there, but that role is just for facilitating that conversation, right? And what I should be asking or saying to the client, just did you bring a copy of your lease? Right. So now we're gonna, I mean, Peggy, I don't know if you want to mention anything else.
No, I think that's fine. No, that's great. You can go right ahead. I was just focused on that sick part, the reason for the sick. So this clip is from Comedy Central, and hopefully people understand why we added the notation that the world's worst translator is not actually what they should have called this. They should have called it the world's worst interpreter. So anyway, that's all.
Right. So we'll just play this video, right? I think the title of this video gives a hint of what it may be about. I mean, especially after that practice, in terms of what you should and shouldn't be asking, or who you should be asking. So I'll just go ahead and play it.
Este trato es muy grande. Yo nunca he hecho esto antes, bro.
Tranquilo, hermano. Simplemente traduce exactamente lo que dicen.
Exactamente lo que dice. Ok. El jefe will see you now. Come with me. El jefe.
I got the money. You got the weapons?
If you want to talk to him, you talk to me.
Oh, you're the translator.
Ah, tú eres el traductor.
No, tú eres el traductor.
No, you are the translator.
Okay? I got the money.
Yo tengo el... Ay, perdón.
No te escuché, tosiste.
I didn't hear you, you coughed.
No, I didn't. I didn't cough. You coughed.
No, yo no tosí, tú tosiste.
Deja de decir que yo tosí.
Stop saying that I coughed.
You coughed when you spoke to El Jefe.
Tú tosiste cuando hablaste con el jefe.
¿De qué estás hablando, traductor?
Ah, translator, what are you talking about?
Can I, try talking to him alone?
¿Puedo hablar con él a solas?
Sí, yo me voy.
Yes, I will go.
What? No. No. Hey, I meant us.
Ah, ¿se refiere a nosotros?
Sí, ven acá.
Yes, come here.
Espera, pensé que querías hablar conmigo solo.
Wait, I thought you wanted to talk to me alone.
Yeah, exactly.
Sí, exactamente.
Entonces ven acá.
Then come here.
No. Look, do you have the... How do you say? Las armas.
Mira, tú tienes las, ¿cómo se dice? The weapons.
¿Qué es weapons?
What is las armas?
Weapons! Las armas!
Armas, weapons.
Sí, las armas, pero ¿qué es weapons?
Yes, weapons, but what is las armas?
You are the worst f***ing translator.
Tú eres el peor traductor.
Tú, verdad que yo no soy traductor.
No, you, I'm not a translator.
Not him, you!
Él no dice que me joda a mí, que te jodas tú. Jefe, yo no tuve nada que ver, ¿ok? Es culpa de él completamente, ¿ok?
Whoa, wait, hey.
No. I'm on your side. Relax, ¿ok? Jefe, mata al americano.
Wait, whoa. Are you telling him to kill me?
No, mata al americano ese Guatemalan rice dish, ¿ok? Con la pistola, bang, ahora, bang.
Okay. See, that does sound like you're telling him to shoot me.
No, that's how you cook it. That's how, bang. Ahora, en la cabeza, dale.
Okay, he shoots me, I shoot you.
Él me dispara, yo te disparo.
Espera. ¿Te refieres a ti o a él?
Wait, do you mean you or him?
You!
Cu. Pío.
Lo siento.
Anyway, completely ridiculous, but we'll also talk in a little bit about ways that people step out of the role of interpreting and to avoid the confusion that the example showed. We have another clip, very different, but the point of this next clip that's coming up, it was hilarious. Thank you. I don't know if you could tell, but I've seen this numbers of times. I just can't. Anyway, sorry, it's ridiculous. So anyway, the conveying information, personal characteristics, what we have in situations, well, David gave an example of the tengo 83 años de edad. The interpreter is probably not going to be 83 years old, but you say, I am 83 years old to communicate. In this example, that we're going to see in a minute is an example from the West Wing. And it exemplifies what the language here on the slide says, that when the interpreter's personal characteristics are different from the client's, it may sound strange to talk about an age or gender that isn't of the speakers. But what I think the clip that we're about to see exemplifies is that when the interpreting is done well, and as David was saying, the interpreter drops out of the picture, it does sound just like a conversation. So in this clip, this clip from the West Wing, there is an American Sign Language interpreter for Joey Lucas. And in this case, Joey Lucas is played by Marlee Maitland, who is deaf. And the interpreter, she is a woman, and the interpreter, who is the ASL interpreter, is a man, says in the course of this, I am a woman. And it doesn't, at least I think as we listen to it, it does not sound strange to have that statement coming. So so let's take a look at that one as well. She's a political consultant, and she has come into the office in the White House of Josh Lyman, who works for the president. So she's pulling information to Josh.
Are you the unmitigated jackass who has the DNC choking off funding for the O'Dwyer campaign in the California 46th?
What in God's name is happening right now?
I'm Joey Lucas.
You're Joey Lucas?
No, I'm Joey Lucas.
Help me, because I don't...
You idiot! I'm Joey Lucas.
Okay. I'm Josh Lyman.
I know who you are.
You're Joey Lucas?
What were you expecting?
Man.
I'm a woman.
You're O'Dwyer's campaign manager?
Yes, and I have 3 sources. 2 at the DNC.
What the hell are you wearing?
Me?
Yes.
I spilled some things on my clothes. Tell you what, let's just take a deep breath for a second while I try and remember, where I am right now.
Are you drunk?
I have a very delicate system.
Okay, look, I'm totally serious about this. I'm trying to get a guy elected to Congress. It's going to be a very tight race, and I want to know why the White House is screwing around with me.
Excuse me.
Thank God.
What's going on?
This is my assistant, Donna Moss. Donna? Joey Lucas.
Hi.
I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna go change my clothes. I'll be right back. Took you long enough.
I got stuck at DuPont Circle again.
Oh, do you have any idea how dumb I looked in there?
So Joey Lucas is a woman?
Yes.
And she's deaf?
Yes.
Cool.
Give me that.
We need to go see Sam.
What's Sam doing here?
He told me to tell you the appeal was denied.
What are you talking about?
Cut this off here. So anyway, hopefully the point came through that when she says that I'm a woman, it did not seem terribly strange. We also have another example of conveying information, another practice. We're not going to look at the video for this, but the clip is included at the end of this presentation. That conveying information do not summarize, interpreters do not summarize or explain what the speaker is saying. They interpret everything that the speaker says. So this gives the attorney who's hearing the conversation or the full picture. It isn't that the interpreter is going to be figuring something out. We'll save that clip, the next clip, for later. And David, you can go on to the no cleaning up. We have 20 minutes left, so we'll try to move this along. So you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Sue, for letting me know I'm muted. Still with conveying information, no cleaning up, right? So the interpreters maintain the level of speech of the speaker, right? So do not clean up speech. So what does this refer to, right? Cleaning up whatever the client said or what the attorney said interferes with the attorney's assessment of the client's level of understanding, right? So manner of speaking and also the related credibility. So examples, right? So the interpreters interpret, right, repeated words. So if the client said we were lost, the interpreter would have to relay those repeated words, right? You wouldn't just summarize, like Maggie was mentioned, to we were lost, right? The actual words, the emphasis, how the intonation of how the client said those words or that phrase, right, gets relayed by the interpreter to the attorney. Same thing with false starts, right? So if the client says, well, I didn't really see the light. I think it looked green, right? You would also want to interpret and relay those words of well, I didn't see the light. I think it looked great. Right. Some practice here, right? So the attorney would be asking, did you tell her? Right? Not to the interpreter, but straight to the client. The interpreter would then say, ¿Usted se lo dijo a ella? And here we see an example of that false start. Client saying, pues sí, pues claro, cla- pues claro que, pues sí, lo mencioné a ella, right? So we see that false start or the stuttering of the words, right? You wouldn't summarize that, and you would relay the full information word for word. So again, here, right, the interpreter, there's the incorrect, then the correct way. So the interpreter would say, or I guess from the client, yes, I told her, right? That would be the incorrect way. Just like I said, summarizing the correct way would be, well, yes, well, of course, well, yes, I mentioned it to her, right? So even that false start, that hesitation, you would still relay that information from the client to the attorney as an interpreter. Right. Another thing that can come up, this is always a fun section to go over, right? So interpreting, swearing, and vulgarities, right? So in office interviews, interpreters need to convey the client speech without, like we mentioned, cleaning it up, right? So just a few excerpts from the Court Interpreters Program Manual. So for cultural reasons, obscenities are particularly difficult to interpret directly, like word for word interpretation may be meaningless or laughable in the target language. Instead, use the closest dynamic equivalent, that is, the target language term or expression most likely to be used in the same way and to elicit the same response from listeners. I know this is also one of Peggy's favorite slides. Peggy, if you want to give us an example of what a vulgarity or a swear would be that may not be translated.
No, what we do is we run these. We have a clinical program, an undergraduate clinical program. So we run these practice sessions, and very often people use obscenities in a familiar way, as a friendly way. And so if you are interpret, you have to get the sense of the context, as it says, and not having, a word for word interpretation may be meaningless or laughable, but it's very challenging. But it is also very helpful for attorneys to let the interpreter know, if and vice versa, if there's this knowledge that when some clients just use profanity as part of daily speech. So I think we'll leave it at that. And if people want an example, send me a note and I'll fill it in.
All right. So moving forward, there's also clarification. So it is the attorney's job to clarify if a client doesn't understand, right? So the attorney asking, did you bring a rap sheet? Right? The interpreter would be interpreting, ¿trajo usted su hoja de rap? Right? The client responding, no sé lo que es una hoja de rap, right? So again, here the interpreter, the correct then incorrect way. All right, both at the same time. The correct way, right? I don't know what a rap sheet is, right? Just because that's exactly what the client said in Spanish in this instance, right? The incorrect way, the interpreter would be saying, oh, she doesn't know what a rap sheet is, right? Like I said previously, we want to keep this conversation like if it were a one-to-one between the client and the attorney, right? Also incorrect if it were, right? So the client says, I don't know what a rap sheet is. Another incorrect possibility would be the interpreter explaining what a rap sheet is, right? So a rap sheet is a criminal history report, right? Speaking to the client, that would also be incorrect. He would just want to keep that initial information from the client saying, I don't know what a rap sheet is. Right? Continue with clarification, right? When the interpreter needs to clarify a word or meaning, the interpreter explains that he or she is going to step out of the interpreting role and refer them to themselves as the interpreter, not as I, right? I is the client. So And if I just click on the screen, right, the interpreter needs to clarify what the speaker means by vejiga, right? So let's say I'm the interpreter, there's a client and an attorney present. If I don't know what a word is that the client mentioned, I myself would not use the word I, but the interpreter needs to clarify what the speaker means by X or Y or Z, right? So once clarified, the interpreter then interprets, I had a blister, right? So here, the word vejiga, to me, as a Spanish speaker, right, bladder, it doesn't mean the same in across different cultures, right? Different words get used differently, right? So just like another quick example, before moving it over to Peggy, right? For me, straw, like in a drink, popote. I know in Spain they use when like paja, pajilla. I know in Southern America they use bombilla, right? All meaning a straw. So, I mean, I think just in time probably won't be playing this video, but Peggy, want to give a brief description of what this is?
Yeah, I'm very brief. Those of you who've seen this movie, this is James Edward Olmos, who's as a young actor is playing Gregorio Cortez, and this is based on a true story. The movie's great, and the clip at the end shows the consequence that a completely inept interpreter from the sheriff's, Texas Rangers sheriff, ended up a notorious manhunt for Gregorio Cortez, and he spent years in jail for something that he didn't do. What the interpreter, one of the mistakes was that the interpreter asked him if he had traded a horse, that there were reports he traded a horse, a caballo, and caballo is what the interpreter said, quote unquote interpreter, and then he said, no, I didn't trade a horse, I traded a yegua, and yegua meant mare, which is female horse, right? But it ended up with, as I said, tragic consequences. So that's just an example that the consequence can be certainly quite serious for failing to ask for clarification of a word. We need to again go forward. We're now talking about idioms. That idioms are forms of speech that where you interpret them doesn't make any sense, not literally. So avoid using idioms in English for the attorneys. An idiom is an expression that means something other than the literal meaning of its individual words. So these aren't easily interpreted since their meaning is figurative, such as it was a piece of cake, I'm going to hit the hay, it costs an arm and a leg. So we just have to be kind of aware that we shouldn't be using words like that or questions like that. When the client uses an idiom that the interpreter doesn't understand, the interpreter will need to clarify and verify with the client as well. What did you mean by that? Also, the interpreter may want to explain to the attorney, look, this client used an idiom I'm not familiar with, so I need to clarify what that is. I think David may have a couple quick examples of idioms in Spanish that might.
Yeah. So, I mean, much like these here, right? Piece of cake in Spanish would be pan comido, right? Eaten bread, just right, laughable, makes no sense, right? Unless you know what the idiom is in Spanish, right? So, right, it costs an arm and a leg in Spanish is costar un ojo de la cara, which is commonly used, right? Right, cost an arm and a leg, it costs an eye of the face, right? When you're doing that interpretation, yeah, you could get a one-to-one from English to Spanish or vice versa. It just doesn't make sense, right? So piece of cake, un pedazo de pastel, just not quite there. Right. I think, as I mentioned a little bit before, in terms of how the client is speaking, the interpreter will also want to maintain the tone of the speaker, but I guess here, but without the drama, right? So the interpreters generally do not reproduce gestures except to clarify meaning. And also the attorney will have heard the volume of and intonation of the original speech, right? So, right, if there's pauses, right, that false start, if they phrase it a certain way, right, you still want to maintain that tone, right? If it's something traumatic, you're not turning over to the attorney and I mean, I don't know, for whatever reason, you start laughing or with a smile on your face, right? Like I said, the interpreter's role is just to facilitate the conversation the the client and the attorney, right?
And
So, yeah.
sorry, just back on that one just a little bit. It can be hard because you don't want to, you don't want to absolutely reproduce the emotion, but you need to let the attorney needs to know what it was that caused the client to cry, right? So if the interpreter becomes a play actor, then the attention turns on the interpreter, but the interpreter also needs to do this very challenging role of connecting the emotions or the intonation or whatever, the gestures that the attorney saw the client express or heard the client express with the meaning. And so it's just, that can be difficult. That slide is more raising the awareness of the challenge of reflecting emotional speech and gestures and connecting them to meaning without becoming distracting in doing so, and bringing the attention to the interpreter.
Right. Just I think one of the last things for conveying information is units of measure. So interpreters do not change units of measure. Determining the measure is up to the attorney, right? So if the client says, él pesa 80 kilos, right? The interpreter would then correctly say, he weighs 80 kilos, right? Incorrect way is for the interpreter to do math and know the conversion rate on top of their head, to do that mental math and say he weighs 176 pounds, right? So, I mean, just reiterating the message of whatever the client says, the interpreter's role is to interpret that information to the attorney. And I guess I'll be passing it off to Peggy.
Okay, thanks. So now we're going to shift over to interpreting ethics. I'm wondering if now is a good time to just pause to see if people have a couple questions, because we wanted to leave time at the end for questions on sort of technique, and I can either very quickly talk about ethics or spread that out. But if people have questions on the material that we've covered so far, if they want to pop them into the Q&A or chat, that would be, I'll give you a moment to do that. The next portion just talks about some of the the very important ethical obligations, but I'm not seeing anything coming through. Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to mention if you want to go ahead and do the ethics portion, and then if I see anything on the Q&A, I'll for sure bring it up.
Perfect. All right, that sounds great. So very important ethical concerns, as always, for attorneys supervising the interpreted sessions, that as attorneys must supervise all non-lawyer staff handling cases and assure that non-lawyer staff are trained. This also applies to interpreters, of course. And there's a citation there to the rules of professional conduct regarding responsibilities to supervise non-lawyer assistants. And ethics rules govern attorneys also apply to interpreters working in legal services offices. So this means we both, as the attorneys know, are responsible to train people and also supervise them. So hopefully that can be, maybe with this recording, if you have new staff who are going to be doing interpreting, they could take a look at this and the written materials that come with it. The a video example of proper interpretation. There's actually a one at the end we can show too. So this note of caution. Thank you for the question. This note of caution among practical considerations, that do not use clients, family members, or friends as interpreters. This can be a common practice when legal services offices are very short-staffed and the client is used to bringing their 10-year-old child in with them to various places, medical offices, why not the lawyer's office, to help them understand. Interpreting requires knowledge, practice, maturity, and training, just as we've gone through some of this very quickly. Asking 10-year-olds or children or family or friends to take on this role is highly stressful for family members to interpret in a legal setting. It also can be very difficult for them if the wording and practice is something they're not familiar with. Also, issues in legal matters are often potentially very embarrassing, and the attorney needs to know the full story and not feel like the client is going to be holding things back because because this is a family member who's interpreting. So the next slide talks about confidentiality. The attorney-client conversations are confidential, as we all know, and the citation to the Business and Profession Code section is here, along with the rules of professional conduct. Interpreters are included explicitly in the confidentiality bubble that protects attorney-client relationships. Interpreters may not disclose any confidential information that they hear while part of an attorney-client conversation. And this is a quote from the court rule: an interpreter must not disclose privileged communications between counsel and client to any person. And this gives me a little bit of pause. That's fantastic that there are interpreters available in the court hallways in Alameda County and then go into court. It gives me pause because of confidentiality by not having an attorney-client relationship with the interpreter, and the very kind interpreter, very generous in the hallway. That person, that interpreter, is subject to being subpoenaed and turning into a witness regarding the conversation, and just much better practice. I recognize the exigencies of being in a tense situation, but much better practice to bring your own interpreter because of these ethical concerns and confidentiality and the attorney-client relationship. Attorneys must perform legal services with competence, citing the rules of professional conduct regarding competence. That means they need to have this function go easily and fluidly. And when the interpreter is doing the interpreter's job and the attorney is doing the attorney's job, then that happens. But when the attorney starts to take over some of the interpreter's job, it is a mess, because it's fine if the interpreter knows some of the client's language but isn't fluent, then just say hello and then turn to the interpreter so that you're very certain that you're getting every word and you're not just kind of getting a sense of like, oh, I think they were talking about this, but I didn't understand every word. You need, like in the Ballad of Gregorio Cortes, to understand every word. Interpreters also should not remain alone with the client, because what's the temptation? The temptation is to have this conversation. The clients may tell the interpreter something that he or she expects the interpreter will relay to the attorney. The client has told somebody in the law office, hey, this is what happened. If the attorney isn't there, the client doesn't really realize that this information hasn't been conveyed. We're getting close to the end here, and I think we can go quickly through just maybe a minute or two. I know some of you want to respect your time, and I know you may have other obligations, so feel free to sign off. We'll just go a couple minutes more. Here, this is competence, which is an ethical obligation. Like attorneys, interpreters likely should not be involved in interpreting if they have a personal interest in the outcome of the case, if they're a friend or relative of one of the litigants, or in another situation where they feel that they cannot be competent. Maybe this is the subject matter of the discussion and they have a personal situation where they feel that they can't effectively interpret following the practices that we've outlined here. If the interpreter learns something in the course of an interview that means that they cannot be competent, maybe they find out, oh, hey, wait, this was, that was my aunt's store that this person just robbed. The interpreter should then immediately alert the attorney involved and not go further, because you need to just preserve the attorney-client and interpreter-client, attorney-client relationship, and substitute best practice, substitute out another attorney, another interpreter, and bring somebody else in. All right. The one thing that happens is interpreters often get asked for their opinions. Those of you in the group maybe have had this happen, where the client will feel like, oh, thank goodness, here's somebody who speaks the language that can understand me. We can have a conversation. But interpreters may not give legal advice to a client if that advice does not come from an attorney directly. That's a temptation that they need to just resist, even if they know the answer. Interpreters are not advocates. The interpreter's role is not independent of the attorneys. And then some of the reasons an interpreter should not give his or her opinion independent of the attorneys is it's unauthorized practice of law for the interpreter to be saying what the law is, malpractice liability for the attorney in the office. The opinion may harm the client from being whatever, in whatever way. And it also subjects the interpreter, as I said just a little bit ago, to be called as a witness, because then they're not performing a role that is protected by the attorney-client relationship. So, how should the interpreters answer a question when the client says, well, what would you do? What would you do in this situation? The attorney hasn't told me what to do, and what would you do? And then just sample language. I'm sorry, it's beyond my role as an interpreter to answer that. Would you like me to ask the attorney? What would you like me to say? Questions sometimes, how much should I tell the lawyer about what really happened? Do you think that lawyer is any good? What's the interpreter supposed to do when the client asks that question of the interpreter? Obviously, the interpreter is supposed to turn to the attorney and say, how much should I tell the lawyer? And do you think the lawyer is any good? When, of course, that's very embarrassing. This is the court rule here. An interpreter must not give legal advice to parties and witnesses, which is an obvious statement, and there it is in writing. I think we're pretty close. I think on this last note, risk management errors happen. If an interpreter realizes that he or she has made an error, that person needs to let the attorney know right away. If you as an attorney have concerns about an interpreter's competence, away from the client, you need to discuss the situation, call another interpreter if needed. It's just stating the obvious, critically important for everyone involved that communication be accurate and complete. There's a list here of the authorities for legal authorities, rules of court, rules of professional conduct, and professional standards and ethics for California court interpreters. We'll just go to the next one. Also, some notes about people who might be interested in becoming an interpreter professionally. Certification standards for 14 languages in California. They can be registered in other languages, including ASL. And then just some links to some materials that might be useful for following up if a person is interested in getting certified or interpreting as a profession. The next slide, I think, has some copies, some links to some of the videos. The links there, you can click on some of these we saw before. The next slide has, there was a question about how can this be done well? This is an interesting, this is a Vietnamese and Turkish, I think, some examples. It shows how it's done over telephone, but this can be, these are examples of the correct way that things are done with professional interpreting. And the following slide is about simultaneous versus consecutive interpreting. And that also shows an example from the United States courts. It shows an example of how it should be done correctly to do simultaneous, which happens in court, versus consecutive, which is what we've been talking about, focusing on here in the office context for legal services interviews. And there's a separate sheet that you'll be getting that has some other resources and links that might be helpful related to the topic of legal interpreting. LAAC, I think, is going to be making that available to you all as well. But that's what we have for you today. Apologies for going over our time a bit. thank you for your comments and questions. I'm happy to have, I'm sure I speak for David too, happy to have follow-up questions. Feel free to get in touch with us via email. I don't know if you can put that in the chat, David, if I think we're done with the slide sharing and can go back to full screen. And if there are any questions, or if we can put our
Yeah, we had just a quick question. What are your thoughts on a scenario where it's difficult to secure an interpreter who's a match for your client in a disposition of your client, but you've been working with an interpreter to prep the client for the disposition, and this interpreter is a match for your client, but is also now privy to the preparation conversations, right? So this tends to happen for language in which that like aren't that many qualified interpreters.
Oh, yeah. No, so it's a deposition and having trouble finding somebody who's a qualified interpreter in a particular language.
Yeah, where I guess the one that is a good match was the interpreter that was prepping.
Yeah. The problem of changing interpreters is not that hard, because theoretically, I mean, it's not that hard. It shouldn't be that hard, because theoretically this is a fluid conversation. So it's for the attorney, it's not for the interpreter. Of course, the client may feel more comfortable with somebody that he or she knows, but theoretically having a new interpreter shouldn't make a difference, and that shouldn't theoretically make a difference. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. I think it's really, really critical to have somebody who is competent to interpret. So I can certainly share the frustration. There may be some services, some telephone services that can do the interpreting. I know that sometimes what comes up with indigenous languages, for example, is there are two interpreters. There's an interpreter from indigenous to language of the client to Spanish, and then an interpreter from that interpreter doesn't speak English, and then an interpreter from the Spanish to the English. So I've seen that before, but it's just the competence. It's a ethical obligation as well as sort of a moral one, right? To make sure that we understand every nuance of the situation. If you wanted to try to, get in touch, we could try to point, if you looked at some of the resources, we could try to also point you to some places that might, if you want to say what the language is, might be able to help. I didn't see what you just put into the chat, David. Was that?
No, just if anybody has any other questions and would like to reach out directly with our email address.
You put our email addresses
in
there.
So if anybody has any other questions and would like to contact us directly, please email us at expunge@shasu.edu, and then just with the subject line LAAC trainings, so that we know where the question is coming from.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the messages in the chat. Okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
It looks like you sent that directly to the host and panelists. If you
here we go.
hit that drop down and
Yes.
resend it.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, the challenge of having access to adequate interpreters is really, I don't mean to be dismissive of that. Another resource is the courts. I think there's a link in the, I didn't bring it with me, in the resource materials to the court access to justice work. And maybe there's somebody there that looks at legal interpreting that can have some suggestions as well about finding adequate or getting paid, getting funding to be able to hire an adequate interpreter in a language that is not one of the common ones.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much to our trainers today. Thank you to David and Peggy. For attendees, thank you for your attending this training today, and we hope to see you all at future training sessions. I'm going to drop the Dropbox link in the chat here. That's the one with the materials for this session. We'll also be emailing it out with your certificates, and you should get the certificates within about a week of the event. We'll also send a link to the recording of this in case you want to share it with any of your colleagues. And thank you all so much for being here today.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for all of your work.
Just a quick follow-up. I'm assuming the person asking would be sane, but the question whether there are concerns or conflicts with using the same interpreter for both the prep and the disposition.
Deposition? No, I don't think so. I don't think so if it's done right, because it should be just, again, it should be just a conversation word for word. No, I can't see, I can't see how there could be. I mean, maybe there's something specifically about the situation that would present a conflict, but I don't, no, I can't see how, if it's being done right, it's merely creating the link between the two people that don't share the same language. So that function could be theoretically done by anybody who's competent in the languages involved.